In the years before the Great War turned the world to ash, Germany's military communication network was a marvel of order and precision. Thick cables ran like veins beneath the soil, connecting command posts to artillery batteries, observation towers, and field headquarters. Every message, every order, every cry for reinforcement pulsed along copper lines that mirrored the Empire's faith in control. In the early mornings, switchboards hummed softly in bunkers, operators whispering codes through headsets, while the steady click of telegraph keys filled the air like a mechanical heartbeat. It was civilization turned into sound, disciplined, measured, and absolute. Officers believed these lines were invincible, protected by engineering and distance, as dependable as the Empire itself. To them, communication was not just technology, it was the language of authority. Yet beneath the efficiency hid a quiet flaw, invisible but fatal, a system that only worked when untouched, unbroken, uninterrupted by chaos. They did not yet imagine a battlefield where the earth itself would tear their lines apart. For now, there was pride in the hum of wires, and in the illusion that control could be stretched from Berlin to the front, carried on a current of confidence. In the marble halls and smoke-filled offices of the General Staff, the idea of sending words through the air was treated as fantasy. Wireless radios, they said, were a sailor's plaything, suitable for ships adrift but laughable on land. Invisible wires, they joked, as if speaking to ghosts. Senior officers dismissed the young engineers who brought in prototypes, patting them on the shoulder with condescending smiles. The Army had its system wires in the ground, proven and proper. To rely on anything unseen felt undignified, almost superstitious. One colonel reportedly laughed that a gentleman's order should travel through iron, not air. The mockery spread like a chorus in the officers' mess, echoing with clinking glasses and the certainty that tradition would always outlast invention. Yet beneath the laughter lingered something fragile, an arrogance too loud to notice its own echo. For every joke told about wireless toys, a whisper of unease followed, quiet as static before a storm. The men who laughed did not yet know that one day their voices would fall silent, and only those invisible waves they scorned would remain. Long before the trenches carved Europe into scars, a different kind of battlefield existed, one of ideas, sparks, and stubborn minds. In quiet workshops across Germany, a handful of engineers stared into the blue crackle of electricity, chasing messages that could leap through air instead of crawling through wire. They were men who thought in frequencies and pulses, whose fingers smelled of solder and ozone. Naval operators along the North Sea coast tapped experiments into crude transmitters, their headphones catching faint whispers from miles away, ships calling to one another across open water. They listened with awe as voices seemed to travel through the sky itself, a miracle caught between science and sorcery. Some of these pioneers dreamed of armies talking across battlefields without a single cable. Others only wanted to prove that the air could carry meaning. In laboratories lit by humming coils, the first field radios stuttered to life, rough, heavy, unpredictable, but alive nonetheless. The operators learned to tune their dials with patience, waiting for the faint rhythm that said another mind was listening. To them, this wasn't just invention. It was liberation from the tyranny of distance. They felt the future in every hiss of static and unseen world just beginning to speak. Yet the empire that prized discipline above imagination had little patience for dreamers. The reports of successful tests, the letters of recommendation, the diagrams marked urgent all reached desks buried in paperwork and pride. Bureaucrats nodded politely, stamped the proposals, and slid them into drawers that would never open again. A colonel inspecting an early field set remarked it was too delicate for war and too clever for soldiers. The remark, passed around headquarters, became policy without ever being written. Innovation, after all, was an untidy thing, difficult to command, impossible to predict. And so the wireless pioneers kept tinkering in silence, their signals flickering in secret, while the army above them marched on, convinced that the only messages worth sending were the ones they could see tied to a wire. By 1914, Germany's military communication network had grown into a vast organism, arteries of copper and iron threading beneath cities, fields, and forests. From command posts deep behind the front to bunkers carved into rock, miles of wire stitched the empire together. Telephone poles lined the roads like sentinels, their lines humming faintly in the wind. Underground, thicker cables pulsed with coded orders, connecting generals in Berlin to captains at the front. It was a wonder of human coordination, engineers routing signals through labyrinthine switchboards, operators translating Morse into motion. The system was precise, elegant, and alive. Each message another heartbeat of the war machine. Officers took pride in this invisible empire, a network that seemed to promise absolute control over chaos. But the beauty of that control was deceptive. Every node depended on a single fragile thread, and every thread ran through a world that was about to explode. The very thing that made the army powerful also made it vulnerable, a spider's web stretched over a storm. At first, the break seemed accidental, a shell landing too close, a telephone line sagging in the rain. But as the front expanded, destruction became constant. Wires were buried, cut, spliced, and cut again. Artillery shredded them faster than men could mend them. Mud swallowed junction boxes whole. Horses stumbled over dangling cables that once connected life and death. In the chaos of bombardment, entire units fought blind, their commanders shouting into dead receivers while the enemy advanced unseen. The proud hum of the Empire's network turned to silence, broken only by the hiss of rain on ruined lines. Repair crews crawled through shellfire to reconnect what pride had assumed unbreakable, their fingers numb, their hearts sinking with each snapped strand. The illusion of control, once so steady and bright, now flickered in the dark like a dying spark, a warning that even the strongest empire could be undone by something as simple and as human as the fragility of wire. They worked in silence, crouched in muddy dugouts where the air smelled of oil, rain, and fear. Around them, the thunder of artillery rolled like an endless drum, but their world was smaller, a coil of wire, a trembling antenna, and the faint hum of electricity. These were the signal pioneers, men who traded rifles for dials, who listened to the sky instead of the enemy. Their equipment was crude, wooden boxes lined with copper, headphones too large for comfort, batteries that leaked when the cold bit too hard. And yet, in the middle of that destruction, they created order out of chaos. Each night, when the guns fell quiet, they tuned their receivers to invisible frequencies, whispering call signs into the darkness. Sometimes they caught a signal, a stutter of code from another trench, a faint reply from miles away. It felt like hearing the heartbeat of the earth itself. They logged every experiment carefully, marking the time, the distance, the strength of the sound. Their victories were small, invisible things, but they felt miraculous proof that connection could still exist even when the ground was torn apart. Each spark, each crackle in the static, was an act of defiance, a quiet reminder that ideas, unlike wires, could not be cut. When the reports reached headquarters, they were met with raised eyebrows and weary sighs. "Good for them," one general muttered, "but it won't win battles." Others chuckled at the notion of radios guiding regiments. "Imagine trusting our lives to a crackling box," they joked. The term static machines became an inside joke among the old guard, a symbol of wasted effort. The young engineers were tolerated like eccentric artists, amusing, harmless, and irrelevant. Yet behind every smirk, the unease was growing. The signals from the front kept improving, the range expanding, the precision undeniable. Still, pride was louder than progress. The army's faith remained buried in the earth, even as the sky began to sing. The laughter in those rooms would echo for only a little while longer before being drowned out by the silence of broken lines. It began before dawn, a low rumble at first, like distant thunder rolling through the valleys. Then the earth erupted. Shells fell in sheets, the horizon flashing white and orange as if the world itself were cracking open. The German lines shook under the weight of the barrage, trenches collapsing into mud and smoke. Beneath the ground, the delicate veins of copper and cable snapped like brittle threads. Telegraph poles toppled, wires coiled into useless tangles. In the command dugouts, officers shouted into receivers that hissed only with emptiness. Runners were sent out and never returned. The entire front, once connected by miles of iron and precision, now stood cut off from its own heartbeat. Reports came too slowly, or not at all. Units advanced without knowing others had fallen. Orders written hours earlier arrived in the wrong place, too late to matter. The empire of wires, once its proudest creation, had collapsed in less than an hour. In that moment, the silence was louder than the guns. It was the sound of an army suddenly deaf and the beginning of a reckoning. Without orders, men did what they thought was right, and that was the problem. Some regiments charged ahead, convinced reinforcements were coming. Others retreated, fearing encirclement. Batteries fired at empty horizons, their gunners unaware that friendly troops had moved into range. The chaos spread like smoke, unseen but suffocating. Commanders, isolated in their bunkers, stared at dead lines as if willing them back to life. The telegraph keys lay still, their polished brass catching the dim light relics of certainty. In some sectors, messengers rode through the barrage carrying written orders on scraps of paper, a desperate echo of a vanished system. But the front no longer obeyed a single mind. It had fractured into instinct and panic. Pride had promised control, but control had vanished into static and ruin. The empire that once believed it could speak through wires now learned the oldest truth of war, that silence can kill faster than bullets, and arrogance can cut deeper than any shell. In the middle of the chaos, where wires lay buried beneath mud and metal, a faint pulse began to rise through the air. Inside a shattered dugout, a small team of wireless operators worked by candlelight, their faces pale beneath the glow. Around them, the battlefield thundered, but they could hear something else: the rhythmic hiss of the receiver, the heartbeat of the invisible. They set up their aerial under fire, threading copper wire between splintered beams, tuning the dials with trembling fingers. When the first signal crackled through, it was like a voice returning from the dead. The message was faint, barely legible, but it carried direction, purpose, hope. Across the ruined front, other wireless teams began to tune in, their sets buzzing with life. Orders traveled once more, not through the ground but through the air, skipping over the shattered trenches and craters. Commanders who had sat in darkness for hours now heard instructions again, clear enough to act. The static that officers once mocked became their lifeline. Within the noise of war, the faint pulse of coordination returned, fragile, miraculous, unstoppable. For the first time, the German army realized that survival no longer depended on the ground beneath them, but on the invisible sky above. The crucial message came just before nightfall, an order to hold the flank until reinforcements arrived. The words, sent through air and static, reached a regiment moments before an enemy breakthrough. They held, and the line survived. In headquarters, when confirmation arrived through the wireless, an officer set his cap aside and whispered, "It worked." No speech followed, no cheers. Just a quiet understanding that what had once been dismissed as fantasy had saved thousands of lives. Outside, the storm of battle softened to a distant murmur. The operators removed their headphones, their hands still shaking, knowing they had carried not just a signal, but salvation. In that stillness, the air itself seemed alive, humming with gratitude, with the memory of laughter turned to awe, and of silence turned to sound once more. After that day, change moved quietly but relentlessly through the ranks. What had once been a novelty became necessity. Orders from the high command now included provisions for radio training. Workshops were opened to refine equipment, and signal units multiplied across the front. The same officers who had once laughed now requested sets for their divisions. Speaking of wireless discipline and airborne precision, the transformation was not marked by grand speeches or public praise. It unfolded in silence, in the hum of transmitters and the steady rhythm of Morse keys. Across the continent, the landscape of communication was shifting from earth to air. The ground no longer held power, the sky did. Soldiers began to look upward, not just for danger, but for connection. The air that once carried smoke now carried command. In those invisible waves, The army found not only coordination but humility, a reminder that progress does not always march in boots or salute in uniform. It whispers first, is ignored, then becomes indispensable. The wireless, once a toy, had become doctrine, a quiet revolution etched not in marble or metals, but in the soft hiss of static that bound an empire together. But the names of those who made it possible rarely left the margins of history. The engineers who soldered the coils, the operators who tuned the sets in darkness, the young men who scribbled frequencies in notebooks beneath shellfire, they remained ghosts in the story they created. Their heroism was not measured in victories or parades, but in patience, in the steady hum of machines that refused to die. Some never saw the end of the war, others were turned home to silence, their inventions already taken for granted, yet their fingerprints remained on every transmission, every command, every voice that traveled unseen. They had turned chaos into communication, fear into connection. In a war remembered for destruction, they built something that endured. And though history forgot their names, the air still carries their legacy, a faint echo of discipline and imagination intertwined, reminding us that even in humanity's darkest noise, there are always those who choose to listen. When the guns finally fell silent, the air did not. Across the ruins of Europe, antennas rose from rooftops, fields, and factory yards, catching signals that carried more than orders, they carried life. The same technology that once guided armies now brought voices into kitchens and parlors. A mother could hear music from Berlin, while washing dishes a boy could listen to a speech from Paris without leaving home. The world, once torn apart by distance, began to shrink, stitched together by invisible threads of sound. In the early mornings, the static that once meant danger now hummed with violins, laughter, and news. Radios became altars of connection, glowing boxes that reminded people how to listen again. Soldiers returning from the front would pause when a familiar march played, hearing in its rhythm both the war and its ending. The invention that had survived shellfire now carried stories, songs, and hope. What had once been the whisper of survival became the heartbeat of modern life. The age of invisible voices had arrived, and for the first time, humanity realized that progress wasn't just about building machines, it was about finding ways to be heard. Even now, a century later, we still live on those same frequencies. Our world hums with the echoes of that first spark, the belief that sound, not silence, could hold us together. Every transmission, every signal bouncing between continents, carries the memory of those who proved that connection is the truest power of civilization. We speak through satellites now, across oceans and stars, but the principle remains the same: to reach, to understand, to be understood. In every whisper of static, there is a trace of that long-ago battlefield, where pride fell and clarity rose. The story of wireless is not just about technology, it's about humility, about learning that progress often begins as a faint voice, doubted at first, then indispensable. And so the air continues to sing a quiet, endless song of human persistence, traveling across time, carried by the same invisible waves that once saved a war and taught us how to listen.